In today's video, we'll be doing something a little bit different. Not quite a compilation video, though we are looking at two different ships. For this video, we'll be looking at the start and the end of Soviet naval aviation. Or rather, commissioned Soviet naval aviation. I've also covered the incomplete supercarrier attempts in Oryol and Ulyanovsk. And I'll get around to the world's only coal-fired aircraft carrier at some point or another. Less jokingly, Admiral Kuznetzov with her smoky boilers. She won't be used here because, Soviet design or not, this ship has only ever served with the Russian Navy. Instead, we'll be looking at Moskva and Baku, or more accurately, Moskva and Vikramaditya, the start of Soviet naval aviation and where the final Kiev ultimately ended up. Why? Because I think it makes for an interesting comparison. Moskva was a rough ship, unstable, and even the Soviets considered her as less capable than they wanted, whereas Baku was the ultimate culmination of the heavy aviation cruiser concept. And in her Indian guise, she shows what these Soviet ships could have been, had they focused more on aviation and less on missiles. I know why the doctrine evolved the way it did, of course. Still, looking at these two side by side really shows the differences in where this began and where it ended. Regardless, let's start with Moskva. This video will focus more on the design and less on the service history. If you're interested in that topic, well, I'll link both of my previous videos in the description. Moskva, in particular, was a recent affair too. This ship was the first of her class of helicopter carriers, or to use the Soviet terminology, helicopter cruisers. They were the first dedicated aviation vessels in Soviet service, although you shouldn't call them aircraft carriers. They were designed to operate helicopters, not fixed-wing aircraft, because ultimately the Moskvas were intended for anti-submarine warfare. They weren't meant to engage enemy surface targets. And for hunting submarines, helicopters were perfectly sufficient, able to hover over suspected targets. It was under this logic that Moskva was developed, to provide the Soviet fleet with an organic anti-submarine helicopter force. With that background established, what did the Soviets actually get out of Project 1123? Well, sources do differ on this point. For example, Conway cites 11,200 tons for the light load, with the standard load going up to 14,590 tons and the full load to 17,500 tons. I've also seen 11,920 tons standard and 15,280 tons full. Meanwhile, the weaponry is more consistent across sources, and another quirk of this design. You see, just like Kiev carried anti-ship missiles, Moskva carried anti-submarine missiles. She was intended to engage enemy submarines herself, not just rely on escorts or her helicopters. The first and most notable part of this was the RPK-1 twin-arm missile launcher. This carried two missiles, each equipped with a nuclear depth-charge warhead, ranging from 5 to 10 kilotons for a kill radius of 1.2 to 1.5 kilometers. Although the launcher could also fire rocket-assisted torpedoes instead. Beyond this point, the weaponry was rather more conventional. Two RBU-6000 anti-submarine rocket launchers, followed by 10 torpedo tubes, split between two quintuple launchers. These weapons provided the offensive punch. For defense, the ship carried a mix of missiles and guns. First, another two-arm missile launcher, or rather, two of them. In this case, it was the M11 Storm, or SAN-3 for NATO, with Moskva carrying 48 missiles between the pair of launchers. Close-in defense, meanwhile, was supplied by two twin 57mm guns. That rounds off the ship-based weaponry. The air group, meanwhile, consisted of 18 Kamov helicopters. Over the course of her service, even this number was considered insufficient to cover a wide enough search net. Something not helped by the ship having issues in speed and handling. The ships were designed for 28 to 29 knots. In practice, they often had issues exceeding 24 knots for a sustainable speed. This on 90,000 shaft horsepower, provided by two 45,000 horsepower steam turbines. As for the handling, the Soviets noted a distressing tendency to pitch and roll. Regardless, that rounds things off here. When it comes to service history, well, I said I wasn't really going to touch on this. The short version is as follows. Moskva was launched on January 14, 1965, and commissioned on December 25, 1967. She would serve primarily in the Black Sea and Mediterranean until 1994. This consisted of 11 major cruises, all of which focused on three things: training, patrol, and showing the flag. So far as I could tell, they were all pretty uneventful, with the result that the most notable events for this ship involved repeated mishaps near Sevastopol. The first was a fire on February 2, 1975, in the forward missile bay. Fortunately for the ship, despite the diesel generators also bursting into flame, she would survive. Her second mishap, meanwhile, came on June 4, 1980, in running aground near Sevastopol. In any event, the ship was decommissioned in 1996 and scrapped in 1997. Which brings us to the second half of this video now. The Indian carrier Vikramaditya. This is an interesting case when compared to Moskva. Moskva was an unstable ship and very clearly a first go from the Soviets at making an aviation warship, whereas Vikramaditya, in either her Soviet or Indian guise, is a much more mature design. So much so, in fact, that a major overhaul turned her into a fully fledged aircraft carrier. A small one, yes, but a carrier nonetheless. This does show that the basic Kiev-class design had potential beyond slinging missiles. Regardless, let's briefly touch on where Vikramaditya began. This is a story that started as the final Kiev-class ship, Baku. She was laid down under this name on February 17, 1978. Baku was a slightly improved take on the design. Her electronics were more modern, and she had a larger command and control setup. Admittedly not major changes, but the ship is still often described as a subclass or a half-sister when compared to the other Kievs. At this point, the ship displaced 44,500 tons at her full loading, which allowed for carrying up to 32 aircraft, split between a dozen Yak-38 fighters and 20 Kamov helicopters. The offensive punch came from the 12 SSN-12 missiles and 6 twin launchers on the bow, with defense coming from 24 8-cell surface-to-air missile launchers, along with 2 100mm AK-100 guns and 8 AK-630 30mm guns. Weaponry was rounded off by 10 torpedo tubes and 2 RBU-6000 anti-submarine rocket launchers, with all of this capable of 32 knots on 200,000 shaft horsepower. As it would turn out, those modifications were a bit finicky in service. Baku launched on April 1st, 1982, but only commissioned in December of 1987. That drawn-out process is commonly laid at the feet of her new electronics, glitches, and other technical issues. This being the late Soviet Union, I can definitely believe that argument. Take Ural, for example, which had a lot of issues in her electronics. That aside, Baku only saw 4 years of Soviet service. By 1991, that state had collapsed, and the new Russian Navy wasn't exactly swimming in funds, with many legacy ships decommissioned as a result. Baku remained in at least limited service, but much of this was spent in port. Though it's more accurate to say Admiral Gorshkov was in service. The ship had been renamed, presumably because having a ship named after Azerbaijan's capital was suddenly a bit awkward. In any event, Gorshkov suffered a boiler explosion in 1994. While repairs were concluded by 1995, the ship was still pulled from service in 96. Spare parts were hard to come by, and the same went for general funding. Because of this, the ship remained in mothballs from 1996 until 2004. At this point, the Indian Navy slid up and offered to purchase the ship. Not for scrap, not in her original design, and definitely not as a theme park attraction like the Chinese did with her sisters. Now, as I noted in my dedicated video on this ship, that entire saga was a bit of a mess. And even now, partisan arguments on both sides remain very bitter. In the interest of not descending to the level of mudslinging, I'll keep this brief. When the Indians bought the ship in 2004, they wanted a complete rebuild into, as stated before, a proper aircraft carrier. They could get the deteriorated Hulk for free, but would have to pay for the refit and the aircraft to operate from her. Initially, this was projected to cost around $800 million for the rebuild, with another $1 billion or so for aircraft and weaponry, bringing the total to just under $2 billion. Other figures are floating around too, such as $970 million for the rebuild, with the total price going up to $1.5 billion. Admittedly, this would have been a bit of a steal, especially for what was a fully functional aircraft carrier. On the other hand, the Indians were a tad optimistic in expecting the ship to be done by 2008. It wouldn't complete until late 2013, after the price reached over $2 billion for just the refit. Not exactly what the Indians had in mind, but the ship did at least come out as designed, though she only formally entered service in mid-2014 under the name INS Vikramaditya. In comparison to her origin as Baku, the carrier is almost unrecognizable. In that original design, she was only capable of operating helicopters and VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Baku's main hitting power came not from the aircraft, but from the cruise missiles she had carried on her bow. It was those missiles that kept the ship from having a proper, full-length flight deck capable of operating more traditional aircraft. As the Indian Navy wanted a proper aircraft carrier, those missiles had to go. The weapons were stripped out, and in their place a ski jump was added. Specifically a ski jump of 14.3 degrees, allowing for more traditional launching of aircraft. Similarly, a resting gear was fitted to allow her to land aircraft the old-fashioned way. This consists of 3 arrestor wires and 3 gears to go along with them. Further structural modifications were made, including sponsons to increase the width of the flight deck. You can see these sponsons when you look at a top-down view of Baku and Vikramaditya side by side. It's most notable on the stern, where an extra section of hull was added specifically to enable proper launches off the ski jump. Less immediately visible, but still present, was an increase to her stern length, to once again increase the runway area. That is not an insubstantial amount of work, even without talking about improvements to the old elevators, or needing to rebuild most, if not all, of the 2,500 or so compartments aboard the ship, as well as rebuilding the superstructure to fit a new and more modern radar set. And this isn't even touching on the fact the ship had to have her electrical system stripped out and completely replaced to power more modern radar. Similarly, her boilers were replaced by new models running off of diesel fuel. In any event, Vikramaditya's power plant is, as designed, capable of 180,000 shaft horsepower. This allows for a speed in excess of 30 knots in theory. Now, to round off the changes to the design. The Indians initially got the ship with no weaponry fitted. This left her rather reliant on escorts or her own air wing for self-defense, which is not exactly ideal. It wouldn't be until 2015 that after a short refit, Vikramaditya was fitted with self-defense weaponry. In this case, 4 AK-630 Sea Whiz guns and a Barak 1 surface-to-air missile system stripped from an old frigate. That would, in turn, be replaced by a more modern Barak 8 system in 2017. All of this resulted in a ship that is almost unrecognizable as a Kiev outside of the hull form and the superstructure. It makes for a drastic difference compared to her sisters, and even more so to Moskva. You can see why I chose to cover her and Moskva together. It does a very good job of showing how Soviet naval aviation began and where it would end up. Yeah, Vikramaditya is an Indian ship, with an Indian requested rebuild. At the same time, she was the final Soviet aircraft carrier. Heavy aviation cruiser to be more accurate. And now, now she's a modern aircraft carrier, though the air group remains small. Generally cited as 36, split between 26 MiG-29K fighters and 10 more modern Kamov helicopters. It really does make for an interesting contrast, I think, and shows the potential that the Kievs had if the Soviets had opted for a more dedicated aircraft carrier. Speaking of which, I will, as noted before, cover Kuznetzov at some point. The final Soviet aircraft carrier to be built, though she only entered service under the Russian flag. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.